Women have better sex under socialism. Yes, that's socialism, with angry mustached men, dictatorial strictness, personality cults, and whatever else the average person might associate with it. That very socialism, with all of its faults and deficiencies, has provided the conditions which led to female economic independence, better labor conditions, better work-family balance, and yes, even better sex. If you're a woman or consider yourself a moderately progressive person while still having your suspicions and doubts about socialism, trust me, you're in for a ride with this one. Because based on all tangible results of real policies, based on raw data and opinion polls, compared to capitalism at that same time period, socialist countries have been championing and pushing female emancipation and improving women's satisfaction on all possible fronts with incredible speed. And funnily enough, this ultimately showed in women under socialism being much more satisfied with their sex lives. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, the main impulse for most of the emancipatory policies for women in the West that we now take for granted came from the Soviet Union and other socialist states, which were the very first in human history to introduce rights and freedoms that were considered lunacy in the quote-unquote developed capitalist world. This revolutionary impulse literally forced them to eventually keep up by introducing women into the labor force with certain state-sponsored protections, and thus giving them more economic autonomy, as reluctant and slow as they were to do so. All this only and exclusively because of the looming threat of communist revolution. But then, the collapse of state socialism in 1989 created a perfect laboratory to investigate the effects of capitalism on women's lives. Ever since, without the looming threat of a rival superpower, not only have these material gains, protections, and social programs been progressively dismantled, but we've also seen ever more misogyny, more incels, more femicides, sexual assault, abortion bans, instances of actual gender apartheid, and, expectedly, as the compounding result of all of these symptoms, unmistakable female dissatisfaction in intimate relationships. So, objectively, with the material basis and socioeconomic empowerment that socialist policies have historically provided, women simply have better sex under socialism, and the data about it doesn't lie. However, as I've explored in several videos before, that socialism of the 20th century was by no means complete, flawless, or some sort of utopia, but neither was it a tyrannical nightmare we are all led to believe. And when it comes to the lives of women in the workplace and institutions and positions of power, in the households and between the sheets, it brought a monumental improvement, unparalleled by anything else in human history. So let's take a look at the how and why. But before we come to that, let me ask you something. Is it just me, or is searching for your favorite show on Netflix while on a trip and discovering it's not available at your location, or even worse, seeing this screen on a spicy YouTube video you've been looking forward to watching, really damn infuriating? Well, it sure is for me. But worry not, because Surfshark VPN, the sponsor of today's video, has the right solution for that. Surfshark not only allows you to safely browse the internet by protecting your privacy and hiding your IP address, but also helps you to bypass all of Netflix's geo restrictions and watch content that may be otherwise unavailable in your country. And if there's something that sounds even better than bypassing restrictions, then that's changing your device's location, getting cheaper prices for plane tickets, hotel rooms, online stores, subscription services, you name it. And if that wasn't enough, you'll also get their extra subscription pack Surfshark One, which has even more awesome features like Surfshark Alert, which helps you stay informed about who might be using and stealing your online data in real time. So make sure to grab their special Black Friday offer and protect your privacy with Surfshark VPN with 4 months of free access with my link surfshark.com/BalkanOdyssey. And don't let predatory pricing or geo restrictions prevent you from enjoying the things you like. Thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring, and now back to the video. So, before we jump to the reality of 20th century actually existing socialism and see just how it compares to what we have today, let's take a quick and frankly shallow glance at just how capitalism has negatively affected women's lives back then as it does now, and how that translates into, for most women at least, unsatisfying intimate relationships. So here's a quick rundown of how capitalism and class society more broadly disproportionately harms women, with sources for further reading in case you're not immediately convinced. And trust me, it's much more than just a gender pay gap that many are so quick to dismiss. So, first and foremost, competitive labor markets discriminate against those whose reproductive biology makes them primarily responsible for childbearing. Only a small minority of countries have adequate support systems and protections for mothers who are, upon entering pregnancy, often left to either fend for themselves or rely on their husband's paycheck to keep her and her child, well, alive. Many employers, even in the most developed capitalist countries, are extremely intolerant of women's reproductive burdens, whether it be the monthly cycle or planned pregnancy, and often afford the bare minimum of leniency required by law, but are otherwise quite unhappy about those pesky little things getting in the way of their profits. And as we all know, profit is the first and last word in the capitalist mode of production, and such unreliability of female labor it simply cannot tolerate. The most basic of human needs, if not imposed by laws that were valiantly fought for centuries and imposed out of fear of communist revolution, would go down the drain in favor of protecting shareholder profits. But guess what? It doesn't end with pregnancy. Choose your data source and you find the same story. Unemployment and poverty plague women with children. Employers discriminate against women without children because they might have them in the future. Furthermore, in the United States in 2013, women over the age of 65 suffered from poverty at much greater rates than men, and dominated those in the category of extreme poverty. Globally, women face higher rates of economic deprivation. Women are often the last to be hired and the first to be fired in cyclical downturns. And when they do find employment, bosses pay them less than men. And yes, the gender pay gap is real, despite all of the mental gymnastics performed by this or that charlatan trying to legitimize inequality. Moreover, when states need to slash government spending on education, healthcare, or old age pensions, mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives must pick up the slack, diverting their energies to care for the young, the sick, and the elderly. Capitalism thrives on women's unpaid labor in the home because women's care work supports lower taxes. Lower taxes mean higher profits for those already at the top of the income ladder, mostly men. And why aren't the dozens upon dozens of hours of domestic labor after women come work from home actually paid? Well, because it's not an economic activity on the market. It doesn't have a concrete exchange value, and it isn't sold in a wage-labor relation. It's an unpaid use value that is taken for granted and conveniently remains invisible in the eyes of the otherwise omnipresent market. What's worse, it contributes no funds towards her own social security in old age, it accumulates no work experience, and creates a black hole on her resume, one that will require a lot of explaining away if she ever hopes to rejoin the labor force. To put it into perspective on just how bad things were for women up until very recently, at the same time when socialist countries were pushing for empowerment emancipation on all fronts, married West German women could not work outside of the home without their husband's permission until 1957. Laws prohibiting married women from entering into contracts without their husband's permission persisted in the United States until the 1960s. Women in Switzerland didn't earn the right to vote at the federal level until 1971. Only once the pressure of the socialist bloc caused progressive social uproar in the West did these rights finally get granted. But up until that point, under the capitalist system, women found themselves worse off than men. As Bernard Shaw wrote in 1928, Because as capitalism made a slave of the man, and then by paying women through him, made her his slave, she became the slave of a slave, which is the worst sort of slavery. Okay, so what were these progressive policies stemming from socialism that put such immense pressure onto the capitalist world to keep up? Well, where do we even begin? As revolutionary Inessa Armand famously declared, if women's liberation is unthinkable without communism, then communism is unthinkable without women's liberation. Although important differences existed between countries and none achieved full equality in practice, these nations did expend vast resources to invest in women's education and training, and to promote them in professions previously dominated by men. Understanding the demands of reproductive biology, they also attempted to socialize domestic work and childcare by building a network of public creches, kindergartens, laundries, and cafeterias. Extended job-protected maternity leaves and child benefits allowed women to find at least a modicum of work-family balance. Moreover, 20th century state socialism did improve the material conditions of millions of women's lives. Maternal and infant mortality declined, life expectancy increased, and illiteracy all but disappeared. To take just one example, the majority of Albanian women were illiterate before the imposition of socialism in 1945. Just 10 years later, the entire population under 40 could read and write, and by the 1980s, half of Albania's university students were women. Furthermore, the state socialists in the USSR and Eastern Europe were so successful at giving women economic opportunities outside the home that initially, for 2 decades after the end of World War II, women's wage work was conflated with the evils of communism, which compromised the American way of life with male breadwinners and female homemakers. Fearing communist superiority in the space race in the 50s, the American government was quick to implement policies against the cultural desire to keep women as dependent housewives, and in panic, pushed opportunities for them to pursue careers as scientists, engineers, and athletes. They feared the state socialists enjoyed an advantage in technological development because they had double the brainpower. The Russians educated women and funneled the best and the brightest into scientific research. They received perhaps the biggest shock in 1963, when Valentina Tereshkova became the first female cosmonaut, spent more time orbiting the Earth than all male astronauts in the United States had combined. While different countries pursued different policies, in general, state socialist governments reduced women's economic dependence on men by making men and women equal recipients of services from the socialist state. These policies helped to decouple love and intimacy from economic considerations. When women enjoy their own sources of income, and the state guarantees social security in old age, illness, and disability, women have no economic reason to stay in abusive, unfulfilling, or otherwise unhealthy relationships. In countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and East Germany, women's economic independence translated into a culture in which personal relationships could be freed from market influences. Women didn't have to marry for money. But of course, just as we can learn from the experiences of Eastern Europe, we shouldn't ignore the downsides. Women's rights in the Eastern Bloc failed to include a concern for same-sex couples and gender nonconformity. Abortion served as a primary form of birth control in the countries where it was available on demand. Most Eastern European states strongly encouraged women to become mothers, with Romania, Albania, and the USSR under Stalin forcing women to have children they didn't want. State socialist governments suppressed discussions of sexual harassment, domestic violence, and rape, and although they tried to get men involved in housework and childcare, men largely resisted challenges to traditional gender roles. Many women suffered under a double burden of mandatory formal employment and domestic work, which was yet to be fully alleviated. Traditional gender roles still remained firmly ingrained in societies where religious belief persisted in the private sphere, and patriarchal structures and homophobia were by no means even close to being completely eliminated. But overall, despite all drawbacks, the achievements and successes of socialist emancipation and liberation of women are undeniable and were an enormous step forward. And this brings us to the most fascinating part and to the title of this video: how all of this translated into more fulfilling, intimate relationships for women. The East-West divide in Germany could serve as a perfect experiment of an near-identical population experiencing two different systems. According to German cultural studies professor Ingrid Schaap, the East Germans created a situation in which women were no longer dependent on men, giving them a sense of autonomy that encouraged more generous male behavior in the bedroom. If West German girlfriends and wives were unhappy with the sexual performance of their male partners, they had few options open to them. Because women relied on men to support them financially, at best, they could gently try to nudge their partners into being more attentive to their needs. In the East, men who desired sexual relations with women could not rely on money to buy them access, and had incentives to improve their behavior. Sharp explains, divorce in the GDR was relatively simple and had few financial or social consequences for either partner. Both marriage and divorce rates were far higher than in the West. The SED argued that these figures reflected a beneficial desire for marriages based on love. Stale, unsatisfying relationships could be steadily dissolved and productive ones easily begun. The fact that women instigated the majority of divorce proceedings was heralded as a sign of their emancipation. Unlike in the West, women were not forced by economic dependence to remain in marriages they no longer enjoyed. Women's economic independence and the concomitant decline in relationships based on economic exchange fueled East German claims that socialists enjoyed more satisfying personal lives. But rather than merely focusing on love, as Kollontai would have done, East German researchers went out of their way to demonstrate that their compatriots had more frequent and more satisfying sex. They argued that the socialist system improved people's sex lives precisely because sex was no longer a commodity to be bought and sold on the open market. Pornography and prostitution were banned, after all. Because East German researchers focused on sexual satisfaction, and especially female sexual satisfaction, they conducted a wide variety of empirical studies to try to demonstrate the superiority of socialism in the bedroom. Bearing in mind the many methodological challenges of measuring subjective experiences, these studies provide some interesting evidence that people had better sex under socialism, despite the many caveats explored in Kristen Godze's fascinating book that this video is based on. To sum up the various results, they found that the East German women said they enjoyed sex more and reported a higher rate of orgasm than their Western counterparts. 80% saying they experience it almost always in the East, compared to only 63% in the West. They also found that the GDR's men's and women's preferences were more in sync with each other compared to the West, resulting in the fact that they were statistically more interested in getting married. And ultimately, they reported higher rates of happiness after intercourse. Concretely, only 18% of GDR females were not happy after sex, compared to almost half of the surveyed females in the Federal Republic of Germany. Betts and McLean's 2011 book, Love in the Time of Communism, reaffirms the idea that female economic independence did contribute to a unique, non-commodified, perhaps more natural and free form of sexuality that flourished in the East. Subsequent sociological studies in Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, which Godze talks about in more detail in her book, reveal that sexual attitudes of the socialist youth were quite different and notably more progressive and free for their time, while at the same time critical and dismissive of prostitution and pornography, which were, as forms of predatory economic exploitation, completely prohibited and valiantly fought against throughout the Eastern Bloc. But perhaps equally fascinating is what happened after the fall of state socialism, allowing for a direct empirical comparison of the same women's lives under two different systems. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, new democratic governments rapidly privatized state assets and dismantled social safety nets. Men, under these new emerging capitalist economies, regained their quote-unquote natural roles as family patriarchs, and women were expected to return home as mothers and wives, supported by their husbands. Across Eastern Europe, post-1989, nationalists argued that capitalist competition would relieve women of the notorious double burden and restore familiar and societal harmony by allowing men to reassert their masculine authority as breadwinners. However, naturally, this meant that men could once again wield financial power over women. Moreover, the commodification of women's sexuality in Russia could be observed in the dramatic increase in sex work, pornography, strategic marriages for money, and what the authors call sponsorship, whereby wealthy men sponsor their mistresses, with women paying thousands of dollars for courses on how to become a successful gold digger. The fucking world we live in. But equally fascinatingly, the renowned historian of sexuality, Dagmar Herzog, shared a conversation with several East German men in their late 40s in 2006. They told her that it was really annoying that East German women had so much sexual self-confidence and economic independence. Money was useless, they complained. The few extra Eastern marks that a doctor could make, in contrast with, say, someone who worked in the theater, did absolutely no good, they explained, in luring or retaining women the way a doctor's salary could and did in the West. You had to be interesting. What pressure? And as one revealed, I have much more power now as a man in unified Germany than I ever did in communist days. As Kristen Godze perfectly describes the post-communist wasteland of the free world, the evidence is incontrovertible. Like so many other women across the globe, women in Eastern Europe are once again commodities to be bought and sold, their price determined by the fickle fluctuations of supply and demand. Writing in the immediate aftermath of state socialism's collapse, the Croatian journalist Slavenka Drakulic explained, "We live surrounded by newly opened porno shops, porno magazines, peep shows, stripteases, unemployment and galloping poverty. In the press, they call Budapest the city of love, the Bangkok of Eastern Europe. Romanian women are prostituting themselves for $1 at the Romanian-Yugoslav border. In the midst of all this, our anti-choice nationalist governments are threatening our right to abortion and telling us to multiply to give birth to more Poles, Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, and Slovaks. Today, Russian mail-order brides, Ukrainian sex workers, Moldovan nannies, and Polish maids flood Western Europe. Unscrupulous middlemen harvest blonde hair from poor Belarusian teenagers for New York wig makers. In St. Petersburg, women attend academies for aspiring gold diggers. Prague is an epicenter of the European porn industry. Human traffickers prowl the streets of Sofia, Bucharest, and Chisinau for hapless girls dreaming of a more prosperous life in the West. Although things have once again improved over the decades with the intense retaliation of women to retain their rights, even in the 2020s, we see the same regressive and backward policies and legislations aiming to return women to the time before the socialist fever dream ever challenged the patriarchy. So, what now? Am I suggesting to resurrect Stalin and reinstate that socialism, to bring about better intimate relationships? No, of course not. That revolutionary wave has left its mark on humanity and has, besides all of the mistakes, also brought about many improvements that got us where we are today. Advocating for socialism in our lifetime, for the sake of liberating the working class or our fellow women, doesn't mean resurrecting state socialism, which, with all of its faults and virtues, obviously failed. That was simply a product of Marxist-Leninist politics being applied to those material conditions and in that time period, in chaotic and comparably backward circumstances, with many detrimental challenges and counter-revolutionary forces actively sabotaging it. With the political turmoil in our modern world and the many challenges we face as workers and as our fellow ladies face on a daily basis, we ought to look for new solutions and approaches that bring us a step closer to the future, one step closer to communism, just like our comrades of old managed to do in the not-so-distant past. Liberal feminism can only bring us so far, and merely mimic the vast achievements of the intersectional radical philosophy of Marxism, without ever truly achieving freedom or emancipation. Because as long as capitalism persists as the prevailing system and continues to burden women on every step of the way, they will never be truly liberated, and neither will the working class in its entirety. Oh, and half of the men will still suck in bed. Thank you for watching, and thank you again to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to check out their special Black Friday offer with my link, surfshark.com/BalkanOdyssey, and get 4 months of free access to all of Surfshark's features. Have fun and stay tuned.